Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to call this meeting of the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council to order. Welcome. Thanks to everyone for being here. I'm going to declare that we have a quorum, and as is our practice, we tend to go around, do a little bit of introductions. That's so people that are here in person, if you see somebody that you want to connect with them because of what they represent or the perspective they have, or they make a comment or something like that, that you know who they are, even though most of us, I think, are familiar with one another. But Darren, not to put you on the spot, but maybe we can start on that side of the U over there.
Thanks, Tim. Darren Hess with Weber Basin Water Conservancy District and represent Public Water Supplier.
Megan Nelson with the Nature Conservancy. I'm substitute for Elizabeth Kitchens today as the conservation representative.
Joe Havasey with Compass Minerals representing extractive industry.
Waylon Myers with the sewer.
Jim Harris, Division of Water Quality.
Angela Gong, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Tim Hawks representing the aquaculture.
Trevor Nelson representing the Bear River Basin.
Brian Doherty representing Tooele County.
Tyler Smith, I'm with the Department of Veterans and Military Affairs. I'm the military liaison and also representing the Great Salt Lake Sentinel landscape today.
Brad Perry, Northwestern Band Shoshone Nation. I represent the tribes.
Over that corner. Go ahead.
Jessica Sanchez from Utah State University.
Jaclyn Plasterer from Utah State University.
Eileen Lukens, also Utah State University. Hannah Freeze, Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office.
Aspen Johnston, Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office.
Linda Freitas, Friends of Great Salt Lake.
Marcel Shoup, National Audubon Society.
Blake Bingham, Division Water Rights.
Dan Strelk, Utah Audubon.
Trip Armstrong, Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust.
Bronte DeRoshi with the Trust too.
Kim Wells, Department of Natural Resources.
Morgan Keller, Department of Natural Resources.
Deanna Baxley, the Nature Conservancy.
Nathan Dow's Cashwater District.
Carla Tremelman, Social Scientist.
We've got Paul and Jen, our AV.
Thanks as ever to Paul and Jen for their help with the AV. We really appreciate all their great work. I want to thank Angela for all her work in getting the agenda together and helping us get organized for this meeting. I've never found a great way to do online introductions. I'm just not skilled enough, but I would note we've got Commissioner Lee Perry on there, who's a council member, also member Tom Ward. So thanks to them, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I think this is a meeting where we usually have at least as many online as we have in person, and today we might have more online. So we appreciate you joining us however you can, and thanks for your interest and engagement on Great Salt Lake. So council members, you would have received, you should have previously received copies of the agenda, and we need to approve that agenda. Can I get I didn't get any changes to the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve? Okay, Leland
Second.
First, and a second from Megan. Thanks. All in favor, please say aye or raise your hand. Aye. Any opposed or abstentions? Motion carries. The agenda is approved. We also have meeting minutes dated from the September 10th meeting. I didn't see any changes to those meeting minutes. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes? Okay, Leland, thanks again. And a second. Second, Darren. Appreciate that. All in favor, please say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed or abstentions? I'll rule that motion carries unanimously as well. Thanks again. So we're going to kick off with an update from the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office, and we have we're lucky to have Hannah Freeze with us, the Deputy Commissioner. And so Hannah, we're going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Happy to be here with you all this morning. Just to provide a brief update on some changes and exciting things happening in the Commissioner's Office. First and foremost, I would like to welcome Morgan Keller. Morgan, I'm going to make you stand up. She is our new Public Information Officer. She replaced Kyle, thank you, in our office, and we will share her with some other DNR responsibilities, but she will be our point of contact. Morgan comes to us highly recommended from the governor's office, where she ran the constituent services department for Governor Cox for several years. And so we're really happy to have Morgan with us. So any public information outreach needs, I have her email up here available for you, but Morgan, we're really glad to have you here and welcome. Just wanted to give a few highlights from the commissioner's office on things that we've been working on and projects in the works. Angela may touch on this later today or at another meeting, but just wanted to highlight and update you all as the council that Angela and I had a great conversation with the Utah Waterways folks regarding your win-win solutions videos, to be able to loop them in on those videos that you all are creating. And it seems like it will be a really good pathway forward to share those videos. They have a really well-established network, really well-established outreach opportunities, and we're really interested in being involved. So I think Angela sent out an email to those of you that are involved in those win-win solutions videos to loop Waterways in. They had a great suggestion on starting with the Envision Utah study to look at that and see and be able to see kind of a pulse on where the hearts and minds of fellow Utahns are at regarding Great Salt Lake and water use in general. And that was a really good conversation that we had. So we're really looking forward to that connection on the amazing work. I love the idea of these win-win solution videos. I'm very excited about them. And I'm also very excited that we don't just create a video and then have it and that's it. Like, we will be able to use Waterways and all of their outreach networks to share these videos and get those messages out. So really looking forward to that opportunity. Since we last met, shortly after we last met, I'm sure many of you are aware, if not all of you are aware, that Governor Cox announced and signed the 2034 Great Salt Lake Charter. That can be found on our website at greatsaltlake.utah.gov. But what that charter was kind of a recommitment or a reinvigorating commitment to Great Salt Lake and all of our efforts on the lake. In light of the 2034 Olympic and Paralympic Games that we will be hosting here. It was a really great opportunity. We actually held the meeting right here in this room and had a nice press conference out back and discussing the charter. A couple of highlights, some of the main points that charter highlights is a $200 million commitment of private dollars to Great Salt Lake efforts, $100 million from a group called Great Salt Lake Rising, which is a group of private business leaders and business owners in our community, and then a $100 million commitment from Ducks Unlimited over the next 10 years. A question that we field constantly is, what are we going to do with that money? Well, it's not our decision as the commissioner's office. We can help guide some of those decisions, and those decisions are forthcoming. We're just barely, Great Salt Lake Rising is just getting established, and then the Ducks Unlimited as well, coming up with ideas and where those dollars should be invested. And so to be continued on those conversations. But if you are interested in looking at the charter, also, if you're interested in signing the Great Salt Lake Charter, you can find that on our website. It's a quick e-signature if you want to just show your support and get on board with that 2034 charter. It's a great opportunity that we have there. Any questions about those couple of items? Really quick, I feel like I'm plowing through this, but we have a really great agenda, so I don't want to take too much time. Our next update on the water delivery program, hopefully you all received notice that we extended our program funding deadline and extended the request for proposals until January 16th of 2026. This was due in large part to the ongoing federal government shutdown, where those funds are administered to our office from the Bureau of Reclamation. We needed the opportunity to be able to work closely with the Bureau when deciding on those funding or making those funding decisions. And so we kind of just played the guessing game on what's going to happen with the federal government. So we extended that out until after the first of the year. So if you were working with any applicants or you yourself were applicants interested in applying for those dollars, that's extended out until then. Also, the $3 million with the Watershed Enhancement Trust and the Forestry, Fire, and State Lands dollars that we announced together, that funding deadline was also moved out to January 16th for both of those pots of money to continue to collaborate on our efforts there. After that deadline closes, we're going to just work as quick as we can to be able to review and make funding announcements in the spring of 2026 for water delivery program. And then just wanted to highlight, I feel like the last couple of months since we've met has just been a series of ongoing coordination efforts, and just wanted to highlight some of the opportunities that Commissioner's Office has had in coordination efforts. We've been traveling quite a bit. We had an opportunity to collaborate with University of Utah and Wilson Sonsini attorneys out at Stanford University, which also included Buzz Thompson, who are interested in Great Salt Lake issues and water policy issues, helping Great Salt Lake. I had the opportunity to present at the United States Committee on Irrigation and Drainage national event. I had an opportunity to present at Utah Association of Conservation Districts, and then we were able to take a tour of Walker Lake and Pyramid Lake. So it feels like everywhere you turn, at least once a week, somebody from outside of Utah and around the nation are asking questions about Great Salt Lake, are interested in the work that we are doing. And so I think that that's a nod and a congratulations to all of us doing a lot of good work on Great Salt Lake, that we're keeping it top of mind to a lot of different groups and different agencies, not just in Utah, but around the nation. And so it's just been a really good opportunity to share what we're doing and share what we're talking about, and share and learn from one another. Good opportunity to learn about things that happened at Walker Lake and Pyramid Lake. Both of those are terminal lakes in Nevada. So some good collaboration opportunities there. So with that, those are the highlights I would like to share with you from the Commissioner's Office. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Hannah? The table from the group. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah, so much. Appreciate all the great work. Okay, so next item on the agenda is, I think we've got Jaclyn and Jessica from Utah State here. They are going to give us a preview of a botulism study. We will turn it over to them. Good morning and welcome. I think they're just pulling up the presentation now. Can you check and just make sure, is that mic green?
No, it's not.
Okay, got it.
It
Thanks.
is now. Thanks. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Sanchez. I am here to talk about work that we are initiating at Utah State University, investigating botulism and causes of avian mortality more generally in the Great Salt Lake. So again, big thank you to Angela for inviting us here to speak with you guys. So I want to introduce the team first. So I'm an assistant professor in the new College of Veterinary Medicine at Utah State. I'm a wildlife veterinarian and an epidemiologist, and my research focuses on disease transmission in free-ranging wildlife populations, especially as it pertains to their spatial movement across the landscape. Kelsey Raymond is a PhD student in my lab, actually working on island foxes, but she has some really great experience being residency trained in raptor medicine and ecosystem health. So she's advising us on some of the sampling efforts that we're going to be doing. And then Jaclyn Plasterer here is a master's student who will be leading this research. She comes to us from California, where she worked with both nonprofits and state agencies doing wildlife health for pinnipeds and shellfish and a whole range of species. So she's going to take it from here to talk about what is botulism, why is it a problem on the lake, and what are we planning to look at for our research.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what is botulism and what actually happens in the body when it's ingested. So botulism is a potent neurotoxin that's produced by an anaerobic bacteria called Clostridium botulinum. Some of you might be aware of botulism from things like Botox or potentially foodborne illnesses from canned goods that aren't properly stored. But it also affects wildlife populations. So the actual toxin itself is driven by a bacteriophage infection. What does that actually mean? It's a virus infection in the bacteria that actually has a DNA phage that's inside of the bacteria. So when the bacteria replicates, it actually germinates the toxin inside of the bacteria itself. And there's all different types of this toxin. So there's types A through G. Type A is what's more affiliated with human toxicosis, but today we're going to be talking more about type C because that is what's affiliated with waterfowl deaths across the Great Salt Lake and across North America. And I want to talk a little bit about the neurotoxicity mechanism itself. So the important factor here is that botulism, when it's ingested, is actually absorbed through the intestinal wall via the lymphatic system, so in the gut, and it actually binds to the neuron. So in this top right corner here, I don't have my pointer on, I apologize, but this yellow shape, this is a nerve cell. And in a normal circumstance, we're seeing that those red dots, that's acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is very important. It's an important cellular signal that actually tells the muscles to contract throughout the body. So in a normal circumstance in this top right corner, we're seeing acetylcholine. It's transferring across this interstitial space, binding to the receptors in the cell, and it's telling the muscles to contract. Now, when we ingest botulism toxin, it actually binds to that nerve cell and it prevents the release of acetylcholine. So those muscles throughout the body aren't contracting. Now, what does this look like when we're seeing birds on the lake? So there's observable signs associated with toxicosis, especially in waterfowl. And this is dependent based off of how much toxin these animals have ingested or the time since intoxication. In the initial stages, we might see things like difficulty flying and landing. In more progressive stages, we'll see things like leg weakness, wing drooping, potentially increased ataxia, which is impaired coordination and balance. And then in the final stages, this is generally fatal for the animal, and it will see flaccid paralysis of the legs and wings, otherwise known as limber neck syndrome or drooping neck syndrome. And what also can see things like the immobilization of the third eyelid. So that's the eyelid that helps them with blinking. And so generally when we see these animals on the lake, their eyes are really swollen, there's a lot of crust, and that's because they can't physically blink. And unfortunately for these animals, a lot of the time they will die from drowning, and that's just because they can't get themselves out of the lake. None of their muscles are contracting at this point. So I want to point out this video here. This was taken by Dr. Jessica Sanchez this past fall. It is a little bit distressing, but it is short, and it gives you a visual depiction of what this looks like for birds on the lake. So as you can see, it's a little bit slow, I apologize for that, but the bird is unable to get off of the water. Its neck is sort of flopping every which way, and that's because of the inhibition of that neurotransmitter that I was talking about previously, which is really important for muscle contraction throughout the body. So what actually influences these outbreaks on the lake itself? A lot of research has gone into this in relationship to all these outbreaks that happen across North America. And the things that we generally see with these outbreaks are warmer water temperatures. So in the Great Salt Lake especially, this is generally seen through June through October, late October. And we'll see stagnant, anoxic, low oxygen water conditions. This is an anaerobic bacteria, so it needs low oxygen in order to grow. And we'll also see a lot of work has been done on the Great Salt Lake itself, looking at how potentially fluctuations in water, so a lot of water management, we reflood impoundments, and how that can potentially initiate these outbreaks, and how high spring flows from snow melt, so winter precipitation, can also influence them. And then also things like nutrient enrichment. This is a bacteria, it needs nutrients to grow. So things have been looked at related to windstorms and runoff, and how invertebrate carcasses themselves can actually help this toxin and this bacteria proliferate in the environment. And then also slightly alkaline water conditions and salinity levels that aren't too saline, but not too fresh. There's an asterisk next to this because this was from literature that both looked at this bacteria in a laboratory environment as well as in the environment itself. So it's just to give you a general range. It's not, don't take it entirely for what it's representing there. And then in the bottom right corner, this is a little diagram that I made that represents what this bacteria is actually doing in the environment itself. So that blue ring around the bacteria endospore. So in the endospore state, this bacteria, it's not germinating, it's not producing the toxin, it's just living in the soil. And under certain environmental conditions, it will germinate and turn into its vegetative state. Now in its vegetative state, that's when it's actually producing the toxin within the bacteria itself. And eventually the toxin is released and the cell breaks apart. And that's when we see these conditions happening on the lake. So I apologize for this slide and the depictions of the maggots on the carcasses, but this is a very important piece of these epizootic events across the lake. The carcass maggot cycle is essential for these small die-off events to turn into those big prolific die-off events that maybe you've heard about, where over 500,000 birds die each year from these dynamics. And let's focus on each panel here. So on the upper left-hand corner, we're seeing a mallard, a dabbling duck. It's foraging in the soil. It's eating invertebrates, dabbling in the mud, maybe ingesting the toxin itself in the mud. And it's consuming a high dosage load of that toxin. And that unfortunately results in the bottom left panel here, where we're seeing that there's maggots covering the carcass. So the flies actually lay their eggs inside of the carcass, they hatch, and they eat the meat of the carcass. Now, why does this matter? So the maggots themselves actually accumulate a very high toxin dosage load. So they actually have a higher toxin dosage than maybe the initial duck that was eating the toxin from the soil itself. And so then in our right-hand bottom corner here, we're seeing that the consumption of those maggots from another mallard that's coming because it has all of these invertebrates that they do eat. And that unfortunately results in that upper right-hand panel where we see these epizootic events. So die-offs of potentially over 500,000 birds. And this is why a lot of management recommendations for this initially have been related to trying to pick up as many carcasses as possible. But as we all know, the Great Salt Lake is huge, and this is not possible all the time for these die-offs. So this is data that I collected. These are from reports that our biologists have reported to the National Health Laboratory in the Whispers database. And so this is a database that's accessible to the public, and it shows what die-offs are happening in wildlife populations. These 5 most affected species, for the last species, the American avocet, I would say could easily be replaced with a gadwall duck. And this is just because not every report that was reported had species affiliated with certain die-off counts. So this is a summation that I created myself. But these 4 species here, the northern pintail, green-winged teal, the northern shoveler, and the mallard, these are all dabbling ducks. They eat invertebrates in the mud, they dabble in the mud, they live sometimes in these low anoxic environments, and this is why generally we're seeing larger die-offs in these populations. So this is data that I collected from the Whispers database and also in coordination with Bear River Migratory Refuge, as well as other literature that I found that reported on these die-offs across the lake. So you can see from the title there, the first die-off event happened on the Great Salt Lake in 1910. This has been happening for quite a while. And this map represents all of the counties around the Great Salt Lake that might potentially have die-offs from this disease. So we'll work our way clockwise around the lake itself. Let's start in Box Elder County. In Box Elder County, the regions most affected are Bear River Migratory Refuge as well as Willard Bay. The total die-offs, this is the total number of reports that have been associated with botulism epidemic since 1910. Approximate fatalities, this is a summation of every bird that has potentially died from botulism epidemics. This is an estimate given by our biologists. And then the per year fatalities. So in some years, it can range from 40 to potentially 500,000 die-offs per year in certain populations. And that big yellow star is representative of Bear River Migratory Refuge. That's where we've seen the most die-offs from this disease. And that could be related to the fact that if you've ever gone to Bear River, it's very accessible. You can actually see these impoundments, so that it's easier to count these birds. And then if we move our way east, Weber County, the regions most affected are going to be Ogden Bay, Harold Crane Wildlife Management Area, and Weber River Delta. In Davis and Salt Lake County, Farmington Bay is the region most affected. And then in Tooele County, we've only seen 2 die-offs associated with botulism, and the per year fatalities are a lot lower. Now, if you know a lot of things about the lake, you understand that all the freshwater inlets are on the eastern side of the lake. And so that's generally why we're seeing higher die-off events on the eastern side of the lake, because of that mixing of fresh and salt water that I was talking about before. It needs sort of intermediate salinity levels in order to proliferate. So I wanted to give a little bit where credit is due to all the previous research that has already been done on the Great Salt Lake. These die-offs have been happening since 1910, so definitely a lot of work has been gone into what's actually happening in these dynamics on the lake itself. There's a few key points that I wanted to point out here. The efficacy of management strategies has really been emphasized in the research here. So that's whether impoundment modifications, so whether we can make more sloping edges to these dikes, can help these outbreaks from proliferating, whether the efficacy of carcass pickups is actually that important for managing these die-off events, and then also looking at how we can manage water in these impoundments and how that can limit these cycles happening. And there's been a lot of work looking into sediment and water characteristics associated with outbreaks when they're already happening. A lot of this work has been very reactionary to the die-offs that are already happening in the system. So those environmental characteristics that I pointed out before are very much representative of an outbreak is happening, this is what's happening in the environment. So there's not a lot of research that looks into and makes definitive correlations looking into what's happening before in the environment that actually causes these outbreaks to happen. And the dynamics of soil microbes, there's very complex soil microbiology happening on the Great Salt Lake, and whether this actually plays a role in whether these toxins take off and proliferate. And then you'll see that after 2000, the research on the lake itself definitely has slowed down. There has been some work into the historic influence of seasonal precipitation. So they did find some correlations in how high winter precipitation and spring melt can result in these die-offs happening. It's not very specific in location or where it's happening on the lake, but there definitely was some correlations to that. And then some relationship studies in looking at toxic algal blooms and how these can proliferate this toxin event from happening. So what are we actually looking to look at on the lake itself? We really want to work to understand how these outbreaks are initiated. Since 2000, we've developed a lot of really cool molecular technologies that can actually potentially help us quantify how much of that toxin is being produced in the environment, which would help us create better definitive correlations into, okay, a change in pH is more important, or a change in winter precipitation and things like that in specific areas. So we want to understand how these environmental disturbances actually affect germination, toxin production, and these epizootic events. And we want to work to understand how long does this toxin actually persist in the environment. So if it is in these invertebrate carcasses, how long does it actually stay in these carcasses? How long does it stay in the environment itself? And understanding with these environmental characteristics in mind, what sites are more susceptible to outbreaks? So can we make a predictive model that looks at, okay, these are the regions we need to be more worried about in future years? And then are there other major causes of avian mortality in Utah? Should we be looking more closely at avian influenza, avian cholera, or West Nile viruses? These are all questions that we're looking to assess with our research. So these are some ongoing collaborations that we've actually already started since the beginning of our research. We've worked a lot with staff at Utah State University, and this is both microbiologists and ecologists, as well as working with people at the Utah Water Research Laboratory that have been very helpful and insightful in understanding what's actually happening on the lake, what are we measuring at inflows and things like that. We're also working in close collaboration with the Utah Veterinary Diagnostic Lab and developing a PCR assay so that we can actually on-site with serum, potentially soil, test the gene for this toxin as well as the bacteria itself. And then we've met with staff at the Bear River Migratory Refuge. We've gone on site in order to talk with the biologists there, get their institutional knowledge, as well as grab a couple of their reports that they have on site related to historical data. And we've started a collaboration at Humboldt State University with a professor who's actually studying these dynamics on the Klamath. They have a lot of outbreaks there as well. And worked with some staff and agencies at USGS. And this is just to understand, once again, with water biologists, what's actually happening on the lake, what's being measured, as well as some very cool research that's going into putting transmitters on birds themselves to understand their movement and potentially get some mortality data from that as well. And we're working closely, of course, with the Division of Natural Resources, especially with the Wildlife Resources Department, with our wildlife veterinarian, Dr. Ginger Stout, as well as the biologists that are out there on the field, understanding what's happening on the lake itself. So what data are we still looking for? We have a general idea of where these outbreaks are happening with that map I showed you earlier, but any site-specific location data, so any GPS coordinates to where die-offs are happening on the lake, are essential for us because then we can create surveys that are more specific in future years to understand what's happening on the lake. So right now, we're actually creating an online field survey that's going to work in tandem with the Department of Natural Resources Wildlife Disease Database so that biologists, when they're out there on the field, can actually input location data, species data, and other observations of what they're seeing physically on the ground. And also any accessibility information. So we're probably going to do a very intensive field survey in the spring, and we want to understand what we can access as a team on a weekly basis. So what can we access by foot, by airboat, etc. And then any avian mortality data. I have collected all the reports from Utah Diagnostic Laboratory. These date back to 2013, but any historical data previous to that is very helpful for our work to understand these dynamics on the lake and what's happening in these bird populations. So first and foremost, I want to thank the Division of Natural Resources, Department of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands for funding this project. If any of you or any of these wildlife management areas have access to any of this information or just want to ask us more questions about the project itself, please feel free to reach out to myself, Jaclyn Plasterer, or Dr. Jessica Sanchez. We'd be happy to meet with you and talk with you more about the project. Are there any questions right now?
Thanks, Jaclyn. Thanks, Jessica, for being here. We'll start here at the table. Go ahead, Leland.
You mentioned that in your presentation that there might be a connection with the level of nutrients in the water, yet your highest die-off is in Bear River Bay and Willard Spur. We've done extensive research on Willard Spur with the Division of Water Quality back 10, 15 years ago, and it's very oligotrophic. It has very low nutrients in the sediment.
Right.
And while there is some agricultural runoff coming in through Bear River Bay, it's not nearly as high as Farmington Bay. Yet Farmington Bay showed a much lower die-off rate.
Right.
How do you correlate that?
Yes, so that is that element that I was talking about previously. There's a lot of theories into how potentially invertebrates themselves act as that nutrient deposit. So there's a lot of invertebrates in the lake itself, and then when they die off, potentially from an influx of fresh water, there's a lot of theory into potentially how that acts as that nutrient deposit.
Well, the recycling through the sediment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but
also just the carcasses themselves. So in addition to invertebrates, any sort of small mammals that might die will be a proteinaceous substrate for that bacteria to start growing, right? So basically, and then once the maggots set in, then you're in that maggot carcass cycle where the birds are actually eating the maggot. So it's a good point. You have nutrients in the water, but what we're often talking about in these outbreaks is having nutrients in the form of dead bodies, and then the environmental conditions in terms of pH and temperature and things like that that allow the bacteria to grow.
Right. So as a sink, as a terminal reservoir lake, it's going to have a sink for the nutrients that come in, particularly phosphorus, but that's not necessarily driving it.
Correct. Yeah.
It could be just that it's in the dead bodies. And then the other question I had, or maybe a more of a comment, you mentioned the wort spa tying it to the toxic algal blooms, the cyanobacteria. We were involved in helping fund a lot of his work, and I believe if you read that carefully, he makes the supposition that it might be a connection, but there is really no science connection between the two. It's just maybe the higher amount of cyanobacteria would trigger it, but again, no connection, I don't believe, exists in any of the science done. And again, it's in Farmington Bay where you see the cyanobacteria. You're not seeing it in Bear River Bay or Willard Spur to any extent, but you do see it in the open water, but it's a different type of cyanobacteria and it doesn't produce a lot of toxins.
Yes, I wanted to point out that study to acknowledge that it was done, but yes, there was not a lot of definitive conclusions related to algal blooms. There's been a lot of research throughout North America at different sites, that potentially have more positive correlations. But as we know, this has been happening since 1910, and we generally weren't seeing as many algal blooms back then. So it's not a definitive causal relationship.
There was a paleolimnology study done that out of Canada that came down to do paleo work for the Division of Water Quality, where they looked at cyanobacteria going back, and they had it all the way back before people got here. Right. So it's always been, particularly in Farmington Bay. It's just not necessarily possibly the trigger for the outbreaks of botulism.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think part of the theory about that is that you have this eutrophication of the water and then algal blooms, and then a lot of things die. And that could be related to botulism down the line, but I agree with you. There's not a lot of tight correlation.
Or it could just be the temperature effect that you mentioned also, and they happen at the same time, because cyanobacteria doesn't bloom very well except when it's warm enough.
Right. Yeah.
And so from all the work done on Farmington Bay, you don't see blooms until you get past June timeframe. Maybe a little bit in May, but most of it is in June, and then really heavily in July or August. And that's temperature dependent.
Yeah. And you may have noticed we talked about going in a lot of different directions with this research. We just started in August looking into what's been done and talking to folks. And it's an incredibly complex environmental toxin. You also have to consider where are the birds to actually be exposed. So yeah, it's interesting. You have a lot of overlapping factors that might just be happening at the same time. And then it's confounding your observations.
Well, in the last 5 years, maybe even longer, there's been very low toxins in Farmington Bay also. Just doesn't have enough residence time to develop the population.
Right.
Thanks, Lou. Any other questions? Trevor?
So can you walk us through why the wet years have higher levels of outbreaks?
You want to take that one?
There's a lot of theory in relationship to this. It could be related to the fact that we're seeing an influx of water in these impoundments, and then they slowly dry out. And that slow drying out period is actually what creates those anoxic conditions that I was talking about previously in combination with the heat. And so it's not as related to the precipitation itself, but it's related to that drawdown period that actually facilitates the anoxic conditions that allow the bacteria to grow, because it's an anaerobic bacteria. So it's always in the sediment, but it needs certain special kinds of conditions in order to start germinating.
I'll also add that it's also, again, the idea of what is the water flow doing to create substrate for the bacteria. So flooding can kill invertebrates and mice. We were talking to some biologists who were out on the lake actually during the Cadlick work in the previously to 2000, and they were saying that they would see these monsoon winds come across the lake, and you could almost predict that a few days later you'd start seeing dead birds. And the idea is that it was churning up the sediment, bringing the toxin to the surface, potentially moving water into places it wasn't, and flooding and killing things that acted as substrate for the bacteria. So I don't think anybody really has measured exactly what's happening between snowmelt and botulism outbreak, right? Our case definition right now for botulism is we're seeing dead birds. There's a lot in the middle that we need to sort out, and that's really where we want to target. And just to really throw a wrench in it, I was reading a book about botulism recently, and they said if things dry out too fast, it's bad for these reasons. Too slow, it's bad for these reasons. If you flood too fast, it's bad for these reasons. If you flood too slow, it's bad for these reasons. So it really is a sort of site-specific what you need to do to prevent outbreaks.
Okay, maybe time for one more question. Any other questions, either in the room or online? If not, Jessica, Jaclyn, was there one? Was there one online? Okay, so if who's online, go ahead and unmute your mic and ask your question. We can't see you, so go to the comment.
Oh, this is Janice Gardner at Sageline Collaborative. I'm just asking, how much risk does botulism pose to people who spend time in Great Salt Lake wetlands?
Excuse me, Farmington Bay, we've lost your audio.
Am I back on?
Yes, you should
Okay,
be back
thank
on.
you.
Great. That's an excellent question. So the toxin has to be ingested. So as long as you are, wearing gloves, washing your hands, not ingesting like water or eating the maggots that are on the carcasses or anything like that, you should be fine. But it's a good question.
Great question. Great presentation. Very informative. Thank you to both of you, Jessica and Jaclyn, for being here. We really appreciate it. Keep up the good work. The next item on our agenda is the Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan, really important development for the lake. And we're lucky to have Blake Bingham with the Division of Water Rights with us to give us a presentation on that management plan. Blake, welcome, and thanks for being here.
Well, thanks, and thanks for the invitation. And Marcel whispered in my ear that was going to be a hard act to follow. I don't have any maggots or carcasses in this slide presentation, so I'm just going to manage the expectations. Blake Bingham, Deputy State Engineer, as Tim mentioned. I'm going to cover the Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan and what it all entails, kind of walk through this process. It's pretty a watershed moment, forgive the pun, for the Great Salt Lake in my mind, and water rights and how we manage water rights on the lake. So I'm going to walk through this and start off with kind of where we started, House Bill 453. Back in the 2024 legislative session, the legislature directed the state engineer to develop a Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan. In that management plan, they directed us that we can consider various factors, including the hydrology of the basin, lake elevation, salinity. Pretty much the door was open to things that we wanted to consider in this plan. And then to develop a priority schedule, for those of you who are familiar with water rights, a priority schedule is how we manage when water rights are available for delivery or for distribution. And it's generally it's always associated with their priority date or when they were appropriated. So first in time, first in right. The more senior rights get their water first before the junior rights. And then we also direct us to develop a publicly available distribution accounting tool, which I think is a really neat feature, and I hope some of you will go online and take a look at it. I think aside from just the water rights nexus, there's some other interesting data that you can see there, the volume of the lake, lake levels, those types of things that we collect data and make in a presentation that is easily digestible. At least I hope it is. So the main elements of the plan, and I'll kind of go through these in detail a little bit more. First of all, it defines Great Salt Lake water rights and dedicated water. Those are two terms that are repeated often in this presentation and in the plan itself. So Great Salt Lake water rights are a specific class of water rights. They're generally associated with mineral extractive rights that divert water from within the meander line of the Great Salt Lake. So when you think of Great Salt Lake water rights, those are the water rights we're referring to. And then dedicated water is that water that it has been dedicated to the Great Salt Lake via the change application process. Now that can either be water that has a change application under a mineral extraction right and is converted in situ in the lake itself, or water that has a change application filed from an upstream tributary and is delivered and dedicated to the Great Salt Lake. Something that is unique about this plan compared to other plans the state engineer has developed is that we're not only using the framework of the prior appropriation doctrine, again, first in time, first in right, but we're also leaning into the multiple use and sustained yield. And that allows us to deliver or develop a plan that takes into account both priority dates of water rights, but also these other factors that the legislature said we could look at in considering how to manage these water rights. The elevations that I will get into, there are a lot of lake elevations out there, whether it's in the Great Salt Lake Comprehensive Management Plan, the Commissioner's report, all these different lake elevations. The lake elevations that we rely on are generally in harmony with some of those lake elevations, but they're not necessarily directly tied. We tried to take a look at all of them and as well as some of the voluntary arrangements that Forestry, Fire, and State Land had entered into with these mineral extraction companies, and come up with some reasonable lake level thresholds associated with the priority schedule. Something that's important to note, that the plan does not govern unrelated actions associated with management of the lake by other regulatory agencies, the berm, the management berm, water quality requirements, those other things that are outside of the purview of the state engineer. Also does not provide for a priority call going upstream into the tributaries around the lake. So there are water rights in the lake, the Great Salt Lake water rights all have their priority dates. We've essentially drawn the line at the meander line saying we're not going to chase those priority dates upstream of the meander line. It also allows for voluntary arrangements. Those typically include some type of contractual arrangement, generally with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, and a change application that's filed. And I'll show you an example of a few of those have been entered into as part of this plan, or that are recognized in this plan, I should say. So first of all, here's the table of Great Salt Lake water rights that we currently have. It's kind of arranged in priority. So in the most seniors, upper left-hand corner, and you kind of read it like a newspaper column going down to the bottom right-hand corner. You can see some of these water rights are quantified in flow rates, cubic feet per second. Some have an acre-foot volume quantification. I've already kind of described what the definition of a Great Salt Lake water right is. Again, it's those rights that are essentially used for mineral extraction within the meander line of the Great Salt Lake. And it doesn't distinguish between underground points of diversion or surface points of diversion. So there are some water rights associated with wells that fall within the Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan or the meander line that are part of this plan or subject to the plan. And one provision of the plan that is future administrative actions, whether those are new appropriations, change applications, ownership updates, the plan will just be amended without going through the formal amendment process that's laid out. So essentially those updates can be undertaken without having to go through the notice provisions and the statute or all these other issues that we had to in adopting the original plan. Here is the current list of water dedicated to the Great Salt Lake. This list keeps on getting longer, which is a good thing. So the table gets smaller or harder to read as I made these different presentations. Dedicated water is that quantity of water approved for delivery to the Great Salt Lake under what we generally have called the in-stream flow statute 73.330. But these are essentially water that has been dedicated for use on sovereign lands or for the enhancement of the ecologic environment of Great Salt Lake. One thing that is important about dedicated water is that this water, any dedicated water or portion of it, is not available for diversion under Great Salt Lake water rights. So essentially it's colored and protected in the lake, and it's not available for diversion or depletion. Kind of that bottom right-hand corner, currently we have about 500,000 acre feet of dedicated water on the books, right? So there's some big asterisks associated with that number. A lot of these numbers are associated with a big portion of that number, I should say, is associated with voluntary arrangements that have taken place between Forestry, Fire, and State Lands and some of these mineral extraction industries. But it's a good number, that's a big number. And those, again, that's what's authorized to be delivered. Now, again, whether that water is available in a certain year based on the hydrologic availability is a different question. And we'll get into how do we track this and how do we know what water has actually made it to the lake, which is kind of the crux of the distribution accounting tool that I'll talk about. Okay, so in the plan, it has this big table, a big priority schedule. And the priority schedule is carved up into different lake elevations. It's too big to represent on one slide, so I've just summarized it with this kind of image to the right there. So the priority schedule, what it does is it apportions those Great Salt Lake water rights according to their priority date, but also in connection with a corresponding lake elevation. And I'll kind of walk through the exhibit really quick. So in the plan, when the lake, and maybe I'll touch on this really quick. The lake elevation that we're using is the lake elevation as measured on June 15th of the year from the south arm. So the Great Salt Lake Saltair Boat Harbor. That's the lake elevation that we're using. You might ask, well, why did we select that date and that point? We looked to how Forestry, Fire, and State Lands had entered into their voluntary arrangements. That's the date they used in doing those negotiations, and that's the measurement point. And so we felt it was a good idea to be consistent between the management plan and these voluntary arrangements that had already been entered into. So when the lake is below 4193, there's no diversions allowed from mineral extraction rights. And I'm going to say that's caveated by some voluntary arrangements, which allow them to go a little bit lower, I think down to 4190, to divert a fraction of their water rights. And I'll talk about those voluntary arrangements a little bit here shortly. But just as the priority schedule, without consideration of these voluntary arrangements, 4193, no diversions. You go up to the next tranche of lake level elevation, 4193 to 4194.9, and the water rights, the Great Salt Lake water rights, have a priority date that fall in between 1940 and 1962. They're allowed to take their water, and then you kind of go up between 4195 and 4197. The priority dates go from 1940 to 1966, so we're increasing the span of the priority date kind of range. And that corresponds about 50% of the diversions on the lake, and then up to 4198 to 4199, 1940 to 2008, that's about 75% of the diversions. And then once it hits 4200, all diversions are authorized. I'm just going to bounce back to the bullet comments on the left. So if a Great Salt Lake water right falls outside of that lake elevation in the priority date, they're essentially curtailed the following calendar year. So we look at the measurement on June 15th, and then come January 1 of the following calendar year, that priority schedule goes into effect, essentially curtailing rights that aren't allowed to divert based on this lake elevation type of priority schedule. However, those water rights, and so Forestry, Fire, State Lands has entered into voluntary arrangements with most of the mineral extraction entities on the lake, and they have kind of a separate priority schedule which mimics this, but just kind of allows them to take water at a little bit lower elevation. But again, they still have a floor under which they cannot divert based on those voluntary arrangements. So essentially, if they've gone into a voluntary arrangement with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, filed a corresponding change application, have it approved, it moves them out of this priority schedule and kind of moves them into their own priority schedule that operates in parallel, but maybe just gives them a little bit more latitude and flexibility at lower lake elevations. And those are generally consistent between the different entities, but there are some nuances from entity to entity, and you'd have to look at the change application to understand what is allowed, and those are available, and certainly happy to talk about those if you have any questions on them. So let's talk about the Great Salt Lake Distribution Accounting Tool. In the tool, we use two different elevations of the lake, and we use this mostly to quantify the volume of the lake. And why is that important? Because we want to understand what the volume of the lake is, and we want to understand what the volume of the dedicated water is. So we use the gauge at Saltair Boat Harbor as well as the one at Saline, just to kind of get a rough estimate of the lake volume. We use Great Salt Lake salinity, both in the north arm and the south arm. This is mostly used to account for evaporative losses to dedicated water. So as I said before, dedicated water is not available for diversion by mineral extraction. So you get kind of a block of dedicated water in the lake. Well, it doesn't stay there in perpetuity. It suffers a little bit of attrition, evaporative attrition every year. And that's kind of based on, the amount of water that goes in that's dedicated, the incremental tree ring around the lake that is exposed, that surface area, that suffers the evaporative loss based on the salinity and the weather and the calculations that were proposed by David Tarbotton in one of his papers. The tool also accounts for Great Salt Lake water ice, determines the amount of water that they are allowed to divert during the year, as well as tracks and monitors what their water use reporting is. The quantity of water in the Great Salt Lake, again, the volume, uses the USGS bathymetry to calculate that volume. And then accounts for that dedicated water, which I think is the important thing. We often hear how much of this dedicated water has actually made it to the lake. That's a question you get over and over and over. This is the way that it should be kind of the place you go to determine what volume of water has made it to the lake that's been through these efforts to dedicate it. Here are a couple of screen grabs, and I apologize. I know this is small and hard to read, but these are there's several different reports on this accounting tool, and you can go to the QR code and you can see it for yourself. And I encourage you to go on there, look around, play around on it, and provide feedback. We want to make sure it's user-friendly and accessible and intuitive to everyone. So the left image is a teacup diagram, and this reflects, okay, the teacup represents the body of the lake. The white is kind of the freeboard, I guess. You know, what's not, doesn't have water in it. The blue is non-dedicated water, meaning that's the water that would be available to the mineral extraction industry to divert from. And then that red water, that's the dedicated water. You can see that this is, then it has a list of all the different dedicated water change applications taking water of the year. So this is like an accounting report. So this is for the year 2024 and through December 31st. And so you have an initial balance at the top, you have all the additions of the dedicated water, and then at the bottom you see the evaporative losses, and then you have the ending balance at the very bottom. So at this point on December 31st, 2024, about 216,809 acre feet of water, dedicated water, was in the lake. And this gets updated on an annual basis. So as we go through 2025, if you were to go to the page and look at 2025, you wouldn't see any numbers associated with dedicated water yet. Because what will happen is at the end of the conclusion of the calendar year 2025, we wait for the river commissioners' reports to come in from these upstream tributaries, and then they tell us what water was delivered to the lake, and then we put it into this and do our accounting that way. So don't be alarmed if you go on here and you see, hey, there's nothing coming in under these change applications, what's going on. It's because we've got to wait for these other tributary commissioners to report those numbers. And then the water that's converted in situ, we've got to do that math as well and add it there at the end. But you can see these different change applications. The list is a lot longer now with a bunch of the voluntary arrangements that have been entered into with these mineral extraction in these. The right-hand side is the other report that is probably really important. This is essentially tells you, hey, during this year, which of these Great Salt Lake water rights, so that first column is essentially the mineral extraction entities on the lake. The second column is their portfolio of water rights. Third column is how much volume is associated with that. What lake level is it available at, and is it available for diversion, yes or no, and then the total available water rights. And so you'll note a couple things here. Those of you who are not familiar with water rights, when you file a change application, it has a different nomenclature than a water right. The underlying water right is typically 2 numbers dashed, then a series of 3 to 4 to 5 numbers. A change application has a little A number and then a series of numbers behind it. So if you see an A number and then kind of bracketed water rights, that means there's been a change application filed as a part of a voluntary agreement between this mineral extraction entity and Forestry and Fire State Lands. And they have a different, so then that the priority schedule associated with that voluntary agreement is then reflected. So you'll notice that there are different levels. So we'll just go to the first one, earth elements at the top there. You'll recall I said, hey, there's no diversions below 4193. Well, under this voluntary arrangement, they can divert down to 4190.01, and they can take a portion of that water right. And so this reflects both the change application and the priority schedule. And there's one mineral extraction entity that doesn't have a change application associated with it. It's US MAG. So you can see at the bottom here, and I know it's really hard to see. So this is essentially looking at what the lake elevation on June 15th of 2025 was, all right? So that's down here at the bottom. And interestingly enough, it was right at 4193, just a coincidence. That's just where it was. So essentially that means, hey, that's the lowest lake level that you could potentially divert from. But you can see US MAG, they're not allowed under their water right portfolio based on their priority dates. They're not allowed to divert anything below 4195 for their first water right. So the no, 4198, the other two are a little bit more junior, so they're not allowed to divert until it's above 4198, so it's a no. So essentially this just tells you, hey, are these water rights going to be available for diversion during this calendar year? Yes or no? And then this is how we track and enforce distribution on the Great Salt Lake. I know it's a lot to take in. Again, play around on the tool and let us know if you have any questions. Always happy to sit down and chat. This is the final slide. This is just kind of the statutory glide path of this. I've already kind of talked about when the bill was signed into law. We had some initial public meetings, a final public meeting, some mailing notices. We adopted it October 1st, and it is in its 60-day complaint period, which will conclude in about 2 weeks so far. We are not aware of any petitions for judicial review. So we will see what happens over the next 2 weeks or so. The QR code goes to the landing page of the Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan, and from there at the very bottom you can get to the accounting tool as well. On the page itself, and maybe I'll just go to the page. This is what the page looks like. Here's the copy of the Distribution Management Plan, the final version. But it also has the lists of Great Salt Lake water rights, the dedicated water list there that will remain dynamic and updated as more get available. And then this is the actual priority schedule if you really want to get into the weeds of which water rights are in priority at what level. Over here are the lake elevations, so it's kind of flipped the lake on its end. So the below 4193 is at top, because when we do priority schedules, we look at senior at the top, junior at the bottom. So you got to kind of flip it on its end a little bit. And so the more senior rights are at the top, and you go down to different tranches in that first column, and it will say which water rights would be available for diversion under the priority schedule. And if they have these little asterisks next to the water right numbers, like right here, that means they have a voluntary arrangement. They're outside of the priority schedule. And at the very bottom, here are the voluntary arrangements. If you want to go read them, these are the ones that Forestry, Fire, and State Lands and the different entities have entered into, PDFs, so you can review those. And at the very bottom is the Great Salt Lake Distribution Accounting Tool that you can play around with. And this is what it will look like. And the different reports, you can see the teacup diagram. And if you want to go to elevations, you go to the volume of the lake. If you're curious what the current volume of the lake, and it has kind of two dashed lines. Oh, I'm not showing this tab. I apologize. Volume of the lake, which can say, hey, this is the volume of the lake, and then the lake without the dedicated water, if you wanted to play around. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Blake, thank you so much. Yeah, we'll go start with Trevor, and then we'll go to Ryan.
Just a quick question. So first of all, the 4190, I know that's just an arbitrary number. How much does that change? How often does that change? And how does that rank based on the history going back 10 years or so? How much does that fluctuate?
Are you talking about the lake level itself?
Yeah, that you allow diversion.
The lake levels established in the plan will not change. That would have to go through formal amendment of the plan itself. So at this time, those lake levels that are established in the plan, those thresholds are to remain constant unless amended in a future date. But there's no, I don't anticipate that happening.
Thanks, Tyler. Go ahead, Trevor.
So it'll be determined on reading the gauge on the south arm on the 15th of June. When the lake is separated, because of dynamic management of the berm, is it going to be netted out so you have a net or I guess a compensated elevation of the lake, or will it just use the south arm elevation?
That's a good question. It's a question we've got a lot. Thanks for the question, Trevor. We will just read whatever is on the USGS gauge. So there is no adaptation with respect to the adaptive management berm and how that's being managed. We recognize that that changes the lake level in the south arm, depending on how that berm is operated. But again, that's our job isn't to dictate that or to, and it was just a little too nuanced to figure out how that would work. So we felt the easy button was to mimic what Forestry Fire State Lands did with their voluntary arrangements, and that's what they rely on, that June 15th reading of that south arm gauge.
And then with that answer, I'd assume then that the dedicated water isn't netted out in that elevation. You are just reading the elevation on the south.
Right. Yeah, that's another good question, because potentially if you took the dedicated water out, and we can see that, right? So if we go to the elevations, it will show again the dashed line is without the dedicated water, so it would be potentially just a little bit lower. But we, again, for purposes of just seeing being consistent is more important than arguing over these calculations. We're going to use the gauge, and it's a pretty small difference, but may have made a difference, I guess, this year when it was at 4193 on June 15th. But that was a decision we made just for simplicity and clarity.
Thanks, Trevor. Additional questions? Heidi, go ahead.
Thank you. On these voluntary dedications or allocations, are they on an annual basis? Are they revisited, or are they more long-term? Can you speak a little bit more about those?
Yeah, so the voluntary agreements are have permanent change applications filed on them, so there is no fixed time or temporary nature to them. Again, they are dynamic in that they depend on the level of the lake, and so the amount of water that becomes dedicated and versus what is allowed for diversion may change year to year, but the agreements, to my understanding, have no sunset provision on them.
Like, I've just got a question on, I'm really interested, and I know it's tricky, but this whole concept of multiple use sustained yield, right? Sort of being used, it's sort of in tension with, but it kind of informs distribution of water. And it's interesting to me because in the groundwater context where it's so easy to measure things, then we can really, talk about what sort of a healthy system looks like, and then we can kind of figure out how to allocate from there. But just any thoughts you'd have just in terms of how, that can kind of inform, we have our prior appropriation system, but how those two sort of work in tandem or can work in tandem.
You mean with respect to this plan itself, or
yes.
You're talking on a broader context?
Well, and both, but no, but really in the context of this plan, probably first and foremost.
Well, I think in the context of the plan, it was important, we have, historical precedent going back 100+ years, right, of prior appropriation being the way we administer water. And so to incorporate a different framework, we really need to look outside the prior appropriation doctrine, which is why the multiple use sustained yield framework was incorporated. I think part of it was recognizing that without that, essentially the lake, it would have serious implications to the lake. And so this is really the legislature directing us to do this, right? This isn't the state engineer saying, let's use this other framework. I think the legislature recognizes the importance of the lake, the asset it is, the state that is in, and the need to look at different frameworks for helping managing water allocations within the lake itself.
Thanks for helping. Additional questions, Leland?
Yeah, good presentation, but just a quick question, probably not a good answer for it, but this all deals with the curtailment of water rights as the lake level goes down on in-lake water rights. Is there any thought or attempt at moving this to look upstream to delivery of water rights and a percentage of reduction if the lake level goes down, or is that still off the table?
I know that there have been people who have asked this question. You're not the first to ask it, Leland. It's a good question. I can tell you that there isn't from my perspective, I haven't heard a lot of appetite for that, just given the implications it would have on our water supply upstream. It's a good question, though.
Okay, thanks. Probably time for one more question. And any other questions for Blake? Just looking around the room here, online. Anybody with a burning question? If not, we're going to thank Blake for being here. Hopefully everybody gets a sense of just how important this is as a long-term management tool. And I think it's important to give credit to Representative Snyder for really spearheading this important piece of legislation. I also think, Joe and Compass really played a big role, and we're kind of put in a tight spot, but I think really tried to be constructive, proactive in terms of engaging that and supporting the overall effort. So I want to give those props there and really appreciate your office, Blake, and all the work that you and others have put into this.
Thank you.
Excellent. So next up, we have Eileen Lukens from USU here to talk about surface water movement and measurement in Great Salt Lake. And Eileen, looks like your presentation's teed up, so we'll turn the time over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate you all inviting me to be here today. I'm excited to tell you about it. This was work that I did along with Aaron Turney and Sarah Null and Bethany Nielsen, and this work was also funded by the Division of Water Rights, so shout out to Blake and his team as well for funding this work. And yeah, the motivation for this work, really, I think Blake has given us a nice introduction to it, but essentially there's a lot of attention around dedicating water to the Great Salt Lake. And we were actually working on a report higher up in the basin where we were looking at measurement gaps along river systems in the basin. And as part of that, and we approached the lake, we were looking at water movement and measurement infrastructure near the lake, looking for infrastructure gaps. But while we were there, we realized that we had remaining questions about how and when water was moving near the lake shore. So essentially, we decided to dive a little bit deeper into that in order to help in a variety of efforts, as well as better understand different inflow estimation methods to the lake and expand on those existing methods. And so when I'm going through this presentation, I'm going to go through a lot of information, but I'm also going to use some specific terms. And we're going to go over these, but I recognize that these terms that we're using are kind of imperfect, they're generalized, they'll vary with time as well. And so just keep that in mind that we just needed a way to refer to the constituent components of the lake, but we recognize that the whole lake is connected in the end. And so we're gonna start looking at this diagram like a Russian doll. So we'll start in the middle with the GSL water body, and we're defining for the purposes of our analysis, the GSL water body as the area that is at or below the water surface elevation as measured by the two USGS gauges in the north and south arm depicted on this diagram. And then we're going to go up a level to that medium blue color and define the GSL intermediate area as the area between GSL's water body and then the last measurable point of inflow at either the downstream most dike of impounded wetlands or the upstream most boundary of unimpounded wetlands and or just like canals or streams that are terminating to areas of playa. And then we're defining the GSL peripheral wetlands as all inclusive of the impounded wetland complexes. And so when I say GSL ecosystem in total, I'm referring to the whole thing. So just keep these in mind as we move forward. So for part of this project, our first objective was to document the current surface water movement and measurement throughout GSL's ecosystem with these things we called flow balance diagrams. The second thing that we wanted to do though was to characterize the timing and magnitude of inflows to GSL's intermediate area, that kind of middle section that I was just talking about. And then the third thing we wanted to do was to evaluate different methods of estimating surface inflow to the different boundaries of the lake. So that peripheral wetlands, intermediate area, wetlands boundary, and then the water body. And then finally, we also looked briefly at identifying different potential delivery pathways to GSL's ecosystem. So the first thing that we did was went and built some maps of the GSL ecosystem in total. And so they're exactly what they look like. They're just diagrams that are showing water movement around the GSL ecosystem. And we marked out where all the different water control structures are, where all the dikes, dams, and canals are. And then also talked with the managers to verify these diagrams. It really would not have been possible to create all of these diagrams for the lake. We made 46 of them. So there's 46 diagrams available for the GSL ecosystem, and the managers provided us a lot of feedback, and they not only verified and corrected these diagrams, but they also provided important notes on management of different ponds or other things in the WMA that's important for you to know if you're looking at water movement around the lake. And so that might be like the seasonal drying of a pond or why waters move from one area to another for a different management purpose. So we have all of these diagrams available for the lake. And one thing that's also documented on these diagrams are the different measurement devices that are around the lake.
As part of this analysis, we documented a total of 53 current measurement devices around the lake and 23 historical devices. And we documented things like, what's the actual device that's sitting out there? Is it a bubbler? Is it a flume? Is that data telemetered? If it is, where could you go and find that data? And then we also documented whether or not that data that site had a data logger associated with it. So is it being collected in 15-minute intervals, or is it just a location that is frequently and periodically measured, but there's no formal data logger in place? And so all of that information we made available in our report, and this is up to date as of May 2025. But I do want to note that there has been a few more gauges installed after May of 2025, and notably there's a new USGS gauge that's at the Willard Bay outlet at the A.V. Watkins Dam, and a new USGS gauge on the Bear River near the O-Line Canal. So I just wanted to highlight that those 2 new gauges are in, and I know there are several other groups working on gauging around the lake. So just know that our stuff is up to date as of May 2025. The next thing that we wanted to do was to characterize the timing and magnitude of different points of inflow to GSL's intermediate area. And so using our flow balance diagrams, we identified 199 potential points of inflow to GSL's intermediate area. And in summer of 2024, flow data was only available at 32 of those locations. So if you do the math with me, that means there was 167 locations around the lake where flow information was not available. So we went and we talked with the local managers on the ground who helped us document the qualitative monthly magnitude of the remaining 167 locations. And we documented that data in these plots that you see on the screen. And essentially the names on the y-axis correspond directly to our flow balance diagrams that you can find online, and I'll give the link for that in a bit. But these just show the relative monthly flow magnitude of different points of inflow to GSL's intermediate area. And one important thing to note about these plots is that we ask managers to make these estimations based on an average water year. So if it's a low water year, a high water year, there's a construction project happening, maybe some extra debris that has clogged the structure, those things will look a little bit different on any given day because management of the lake is so dynamic. But based on an average water year, this is kind of typically what's happening at these inflow points qualitatively. But to help put some of these qualitative estimates in context, we also went out and took some quantitative flow measurements. So we identified 3 key periods to go out and take flow measurements around the lake. And this was the summer, fall, and spring. And we went out and measured lots of different sites, but as you can imagine, 167 is kind of a large number of sites to go visit, and we couldn't go visit all of them. So we measured a subset of those sites, and that's shown by the medium blue color in this kind of map you see before you, those USU field sites. For the sites that we couldn't measure, we assumed flows at them based on manager recommendation. So for example, if we were on a pond and there was 5 structures on that pond, it was a pond that was kept at the same level across, and there was the same structure size, the same number of boards pulled, we would measure one of those structures and then assume flows at the other ones. And this was based on manager recommendation, and we changed the locations that we measured and assumed flows at in each season. So we changed the sites that we measured and assumed flows at in summer, fall, and spring, just based on manager recommendations and management practices at the time. The other important thing to note here is that we did have external data available around the lake. So those 32 locations I mentioned before where we did have flow data available. And then also during our study, different locations and new gauges came online. And so we were able to use that data as time went on. So you'll see that's the dark blue external data color that you see on here. So if you click through all stuff, you'll see that more and more points will turn dark blue as time goes on, which is actually, I think, really cool and exciting and shows all the efforts that have gone into gauging inflows to the lake. So the third thing that we did as part of our analysis was then to evaluate different methods of estimating inflow to GSL's peripheral wetlands, intermediate area, and water body. We looked at 5 different methods of estimating surface inflow. 3 of those methods consider inflows from the full basin. So think about water coming from the Bear River, the Jordan River Basin, and then the Weaver River Basin also. And then we looked at 2 methods that
look at inflows from a portion of the basin. And so we're just looking at the area south of the Antelope Island Causeway and then the full Jordan River subbasin. And the reason that we have this kind of full basin method and partial basin method is because of the data availability at GSL's water body. At the time of this analysis, we didn't have enough information at GSL's water body to make comparisons between the three different boundaries that we're talking about, the peripheral, the intermediate, and the water body boundaries. So we looked at the portion of the lake where we did have enough information to make those comparisons and ended up making comparisons between the water body and the GSL intermediate area in the portion that is approximately south of the Antelope Island Causeway and then the full Jordan River subbasin. So we're going to step through that, and hopefully it'll be more clear as we step through it. So the first method we looked at estimating inflows to the lake was kind of the favorite, right? We're just looking at kind of the four main gauges that capture the three main tributaries to the lake. So the Bear, Weber, and Jordan River, where the Jordan River is represented by the 1700 South gauge and the Surplus Canal gauge. And this is just kind of a simple method that is commonly used to estimate surface inflow to the lake. But we wanted to expand upon that a little bit and include more inflows to the lake. And so we looked at our second method, which just includes a few more gauges that are not connected to those three main tributaries. So think about things like Lee Creek or Farmington Creek, where they're not connected directly to the three main tributaries, but they're still contributing water to the lake. And so we were able to use both current and historical gauges to do this, and David Tarbotten and his team at Utah State University have created regressions in order to project historical data into present day, so we were able to use that. And this is really just an expansion of that first method, so we're just accounting for more inflows at the peripheral wetlands boundary. But if we want to make a comparison between the peripheral wetlands boundary and then a little bit closer at the intermediate area boundary, we switched to using our USU field data that we collected, both measured and assumed flows, as well as any gauge data that was available to estimate inflows to GSL's intermediate area. So this is our last method that looks at inflows from the full basin. And so just keep in your mind that methods 1, 2, and 3 go together, and then methods 4 and 5 will go together. So moving on to method 4, we're looking at a reduced portion of the basin. So as you can see in this figure, method 4 is the same exact data set as method 3, but we're just looking at a reduced section of the basin. That's the area south of the Antelope Island Causeway generally, and the full Jordan River subbasin, and looking at inflows coming into that area. And so you can see that just the dots are the same. We're just looking at that reduced area. And then we're doing that so that we can compare to inflows to the water body, which is our method 5. And method 5 uses 5 different locations to estimate inflow to the same area as method 4. And it's just that these are 5 different gauges that are located on channels that kind of definitively connect to the GSL water body. So we can make comparisons between the intermediate area inflow and the water body inflow in that area. So yeah, just hold that in your mind. 1, 2, and 3 go together. 4 and 5 go together. So what did doing all of that get us? Well, when you're looking at the full basin, which compares estimates between, again, the peripheral wetlands and the intermediate area for each period, method 2 consistently estimated higher average daily inflows to GSL's peripheral wetlands than method 1. And that makes sense, right? Because we're accounting for more inflows in that method. But when we look between methods, so comparing the peripheral wetlands boundary to the intermediate area boundary, we see that estimates of inflows to GSL's peripheral wetlands were higher than estimates to GSL's intermediate area in summer of 2024. In fall of 2024, estimates were similar, and then the opposite was true in spring of 2025. So method 3 includes outflows from managed wetland complexes that are dependent on wetland management, right? So it's a little bit unsurprising for flows at the intermediate area boundary to be less in the summer, because that's often when impounded wetlands are holding water back. However, in the fall, they open up their structures. And when we look between the two boundaries, we see similar flows, and then in the spring, potentially gains between those two boundaries. So that was a really interesting finding. Then if we move on to methods 4 and 5, which kind of go together, methods 4 and 5 estimates of surface inflow to GSL's intermediate area and water body were similar in all periods, and there was slight differences in between these two methods across the different seasons, but as you can see from the error bars, everything is really close. So more work is needed to see if kind of these trends continue across different water years, but also if these results are statistically significant. So I have one more thing for you, and I'm going to try to wrap it quickly so that I can take questions. And I know it's a lot of information, so thank you for holding on with me. But the fourth thing we ended up doing was using all of this collected information to then identify potential pathways for delivering least water to potential points within GSL's ecosystem. And so the way that we did this was hosting meetings with different stakeholders in the basin, in both the Weber River Basin and in the Jordan River Basin. The reason that we didn't do this in the Bear River subbasin is because at the time a delivery pathway had already been identified, but similar efforts had not been underway in both the Weber and the Jordan River Basin. And so what we did was we sat down with different stakeholders and talked about potential pathways to different areas of GSL's ecosystem, and then different challenges associated with each of those pathways. So we looked at 14 direct and 39 indirect pathways. When I say direct, I just mean pathways that generally bypass impounded wetland complexes and connect directly to GSL's intermediate area or water body. And when I say indirect pathways, I just mean pathways that generally build upon those direct ones on the upstream portion, but then route through impounded wetland complexes. So like ponds or series of ponds on the way to GSL's intermediate area or water body. And so the types of things that were discussed were like canal capacities, where trash racks are needed, bank stabilization, and then also if the quantity and timing of deliveries would align with management objectives downstream. Just because you can get water from point A to point B doesn't mean that that water is arriving at the appropriate times for management, as we learned from the prior presentation. And so it's really important that you align those quantity and timing of deliveries with management objectives that are downstream. And so these were just some of the things that we discussed. I'm not going to go into detail about all of them, but if you do want to see the details about each of these identified pathways, we have those in our report laid out, so you can go look at a particular pathway and see kind of what the pros and cons of each of those pathways were. The other thing that I want to say here is we looked along the pathways along which like the bulk of water would move. So we're but you know, it doesn't represent all of the potential pathways. So you'll see like a lot of potential pathways along the Davis County corridor excluded. So like the smaller things like Holmes Creek or Farmington Creek are excluded here, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't deliver water that way. We were just kind of looking at the challenges associated with where the bulk of water would move, but truly any pathway is possible at any point. So with that, I'm going to throw up this QR code. This is our HydroShare repository. It has the report, it has all the data, it has all the maps. And I do want to point out our Shiny Web application that we made. This is where you can view our measurement data alongside the maps, alongside the notes from managers, all in one location, which is really handy. And then I also want to give a huge shout out to the managers and everybody around the lake who helped us with this analysis. I cannot tell you how many hours we took of people's lives to do this analysis. So I'm really, really grateful for all their participation, and a lot of you in this room participated too. So we're just incredibly grateful. And if there's time for questions, I'll take them. And if not, I'll hand it off to the next person.
We do have a few minutes for questions. Eileen, thank you so much. Great work and a great presentation. So any questions for Eileen? That is a lot to take in. Appreciate it. Darren, go ahead.
Yes, great work. Appreciate the presentation. I know there's a lot of work involved in this. So I was just curious, you mentioned the new gauge there on the Willard Spur there north of Willard Bay. Do you know if that one's up and operational and active right now?
So the last time I checked, it was collecting elevation data, like stage data, but they hadn't developed the discharge curve for it yet. But Mike Freeman and his team at the USGS would know the status of that better.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Eileen, either in the room or online? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Excellent work. It's very interesting. I was wondering if we're looking at the efficacy of bringing water from particular areas to the lake, dedicated water to the lake. It looks like your study would guide that process, or at least inform the process. In other words, we ought to be taking a look at what you learned and go select specific places to bring water from. Is that a fair conclusion?
So you're asking, did we identify like where to deliver dedicated water?
I think you're hitting the right question. The question I have is if we're planning into the future where we want to go to pick up dedicated water, does your study inform us in that process?
I think it helps identify the pathways along which you could feasibly, like physically deliver that water. But we did not go into like kind of problem solving those challenges that we identified. One like solution that was brought up in discussion was the potential use of upstream storage agreements to then deliver water at times of year when there is more canal capacity, but that also has to align with downstream management objectives at the time. So I think our study really helps to just highlight how water is moving near the lake and where you could feasibly measure that water and assure its accounting and delivery, but doesn't necessarily, problem solve the challenges that are in front of us for doing that.
Well, that's fair, but that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Warren. One more question from Jake, and then we'll call it there. So, Jake, if you'd come up. Yeah.
I don't have a question, but just a comment. I got to opportunity to work with this team, and while it's still yet to be seen gauges that will be installed to actually fill data gaps, this effort filled an extreme knowledge gap. So this work is tremendously valuable for management, right? Learning, education, planning. And so to Warren's point, we are taking all this information and bringing it into the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan that we're working on with the Commissioner's Office, and so that we can begin to explore, those that space of where water is best, where it's needed, when it's needed, and where it can come from, what the consequences are of that. So this is just like tremendous work. And I was just at the American Water Resources Conference, the national conference, and talking to people working on these problems. And we're so advanced, really, like so good, such good work like this. So thank you.
Great perspective, Jake. Thanks. And Eileen, thanks to you and your team. Great work, great presentation, and move the ball forward. So thank you very much. Okay. Jake's comment was a very nice segue into Laura Vernon, who's here to kind of give us an update on the status of the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan. And welcome, Laura. Thanks for being here, and we'll turn the time over to you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. Great. My name is Laura Vernon, Great Salt Lake Basin Planner with the Division of Water Resources. And this is just a teaser for the next Great Salt Lake Advisory Council meeting, where you're going to get to see and hear a lot about the Great Salt Lake Basin Plan, but we're going to get a lot of information from you too. So just a reminder, Great Salt Lake Basin Plan is a tool and a process that we're creating that will ensure a resilient water supply for Great Salt Lake and all water users in the basin. It is a multi-year, multi-agency effort. We're hoping to wrap up the plan in 2027. This is in close partnership with the Bureau of Reclamation as part of their Water Smart Basin Study Program. We received a grant from them. We also received legislative funding. This effort is going to take all of the stakeholders in the basin to kind of get on board and be supportive of this first ever effort. And two of the groups I just wanted to remind you of are the Steering Committee, Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan Steering Committee, which many of you in the room are members of. Those are stakeholders in the basin. And then we also have an advisory group that's resource experts that are working in the basin as well. So just to give you an update on where we have been with the plan so far, the model development is underway, and we just got a huge surge of work has been put towards the modeling effort, as we've hired the dream team, the model dream team, to create the basin-wide riverware model that we'll be using and building on the GSLIM model that a few of you may recall was the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council was instrumental in setting up back in 2015, 2017. We've also hired Envision Utah to help us with the communications, planning, and outreach support for this project. Super helpful and excited to have them on board because, as many of you know, they were involved with the state water strategy and with the Utah Values Survey that I think Hannah mentioned that earlier. So we feel like they have a good grasp on the water sphere, and that will help us move this project along. We're strategizing with them now about how we will come to you and all of the other stakeholders in the basin starting in January. So your next January 14th meeting, I've been coordinating with Angela and Tim about focusing on the basin plan at that meeting. And what I think, while I'm not 100% sure what it will look like, I think some of the work that we'll have you guys be doing is helping us understanding what the performance measures are for primarily Great Salt Lake, because that's what your focus is. But with the other groups, we'll be asking about the performance measures outside of the lake. But just what are the values? What are the values to you in Great Salt Lake? What does success look like in Great Salt Lake? Is it healthy water levels in Great Salt Lake? Is it healthy water levels upstream in reservoirs? Is it the ecosystem? Is it salinity? What does success look like? What does a healthy lake look like to this group? And then we'll start also talking about management alternatives, and those are really to be determined by you all here. We need your help in developing those. But some of the initial thoughts that we're having are that they would include some sort of demand reductions, either permanent or emergency. We'll look at maybe in-stream flow priorities, coordinated reservoir management, maybe if there are drought or flood operational schematics that we're looking at, and then maybe Great Salt Lake dedicated water accounting in upstream reservoirs. This is a tool that was been implemented in the Pyramid Lake that Hannah was mentioning we went to go tour earlier. So keeping a dedicated portion of water for Great Salt Lake higher up in the system, what would that look like to the whole system, to the whole basin? So once we have developed all of these alternatives that we'll start talking with you all about, we'll do the trade-off analysis, understand what the impacts are to all of the different users and uses in the basin, and then we'll come up with a management plan or recommendations, strategies that we'll be able to use moving forward. And Jake kind of hinted at this, but we're working closely with the commissioner's office to have this really be their long-term plan. So the recommendations that we're making and the different elements that we're suggesting, maybe with structural or operational changes, surface water protection or surface water storage, habitat protection, water conservation, market ideas, we'll have that plan, that recommendation be part of the basin plan, but also part of the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's long-term plan. And I did just want to mention, also kind of confusing, but an important part of this process has been 7 studies that are separate from the actual tool that we're developing, but are projects that are helping inform management decisions on the lake. And you've heard about a few of those already. We have the stormwater study that we talked about, impacts low impact or stormwater development or stormwater runoff. Was one of the first projects that was completed, but then we also have municipal and industrial agricultural optimization opportunities and cost report. We have a dust mitigation strategies cost report coming out here soon. We are looking at an important project on evaporative losses on Great Salt Lake, in and around Great Salt Lake, and also in-stream flow projects. So we've got all of these other sub-projects that are helping inform the management decisions that we'll be putting into the larger tool that we're creating. So with that, just a teaser for next time. I'm happy to take questions now, but I look forward to working with you all come January.
Thanks, Laura. I appreciate you teeing that up. And particularly, it is a unique opportunity for this group to have input into that process. So thanks for teeing up those questions. And maybe between now and then, we can come up with an email that'll be a kind of a teaser we can send out to people just to remind them, hey, come prepared with, with input on A, B, C, D, E, et cetera.
Be happy to set something like that up. There also may be a survey or two coming your way to help gauge and get input on these performance measures.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thanks so much,
Thanks.
Laura. Appreciate all your good work. Okay, we're just about there, folks, but we do have traditionally always do a little bit of open mic for public comments. So with that in mind, I open it up for public comments if there are any public comments, either online or in the room. Lynn?
Perhaps one of the future programs could focus on the work of the Salinity Advisory Committee and that adaptive management tool of the berm.
Yeah, great suggestion. There's been a lot of work done there, and that's really critical for the lake. So great suggestion, Lynn. Any other public comments, either online or in the room? Angela, go ahead.
A lot of you hopefully are on the email list, but the Great Salt Lake Tech Team Great Salt Lake Research Grant deadline has also been pushed because of the federal shutdown. So ours is, not to be confusing, but the new one is January 9th. So don't confuse that with the much larger grant that's due on the 16th, but January 9th for those tech team grants.
Great reminder. Thanks, Angela. Any other public comments? Seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and close the public comments. The last thing we usually do before we adjourn is come back to liaisons, members of the council, just ask if there's anything, I will get that reminder, ask if there's just suggestions on topics you'd like to cover or just any burning thing on your mind. Heidi, I see you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll keep this quick. As the vice chair of the Jordan River Watershed Council, I would like to ask the board if they would consider this. When the Watershed Council Act was established in 2020, it states the opportunity to have a reciprocal position from this board that the liaisons are serving to their respective watersheds. And the Jordan River Watershed Council is well established. We're off and running, and we just were able to give our annual report just this last month, which was well received. And we just want to extend that invitation to the board to consider choosing somebody to join our meetings, which are only 4 times a year. It's not a huge lift.
Exactly. So that's board and liaisons to consider that, whether somebody has a particular interest in serving as kind of the, I could forget the word you used, but basically, yeah, reciprocal, that's the word. Reciprocal representative back to the Jordan River Council to make that coordination even more close. So thanks for that, Heidi. Anything else from members of the board liaisons? If you have additional ideas, Trevor, go ahead.
Well, you said Watershed Councils, so Warren's hand went up.
There it goes, Warren.
Yes, hello, thank you. Thank you, Heidi. That's for carrying that message. What we're looking for, Tim, is a liaison back to the Utah Watershed Council from these great. You may remember in the act, it calls for each local watershed council to send a representative to the state watershed council, and there's currently not one from the Great Salt Lake Advisory Committee. And if it's serving the role of being the Great Salt Lake Local Watershed Council, then we need to fill that gap by sending a representative from this group back to the state watershed council.
Thanks, Warren. Great reminder. So there's not one but 2 positions. Your mission, should you choose to accept it. But I think that's a pretty key one, to go back to the state watershed council, which is up and running and doing a lot of great work, and to have this council formally represented in that capacity, I think is really key. So thanks for that reminder, Warren. Okay, seeing no further business, thanks for everybody again for your time and attention. Just a reminder, so our meeting schedule is, did we miss somebody?
I was just going to comment that, we ought to have a discussion sometime in the near future about how we can accelerate conservation, if that's possible, because that's a key issue for Great Salt Lake water delivery.
Just thinking specifically M&I, Leland, or across the board?
M&I, but also agricultural, but M&I first, because I think there's a greater degree of potential there.
Thanks, Leland. Appreciate that. Thanks, Trevor, for catching hands and stuff that I'm missing.
And I also nominate Tim Hawks to be the council representative to the State Watershed Council.
Yeah, we're not going to take formal action on that, but no, I appreciate that, Leland. We'll circle up and figure that out, but that makes some sense. Okay, just a reminder about meeting times. Our agenda for next year is set. So if you want to calendar these items, January 14th will be our next meeting, and this is an important reminder. It will not be here. So if you're like me and you're a creature of habit, you show up here on January 4th. Something else will almost certainly be going on there that will not be this meeting. So we're meeting at DNR in the auditorium at DNR on that date. So that's the 14th of January, and that will be again at DNR. We'll try to send that around in another reminder, but just be aware of that. Other dates for meetings scheduled for next year, and it's generally the second Wednesday of the month, March 11th, May 13th, July 8th, September 9th, and November 11th. We anticipate that for those meetings, we will be back here. It's just that one that's going to be at DNR, right, Angela? Okay. Thanks again to Angela. She handles all the coordination and scheduling the meetings, which is a real headache. So we appreciate you doing that. Okay. With that, can I get a motion to adjourn?
And before you do that.
Oh, sorry. Do we miss one? Yeah, Warren. I missed another one. Yeah, Warren.
I'll just have to show up and wave my arms, huh? November 11th. Next year, that'll fall on Veterans Day, which is going to be a holiday for a lot of folks. So you may want to move that date a bit.
Yeah, that's a good one. We'll take that under advisement. We'll look for an alternative date on that, Warren, because I think that does affect a lot of state employees and others. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Any further comments, questions? Now that I'm paying attention. Okay, can I get that motion to adjourn? Leland, yeah.
Seconded.
Thanks, Megan. Second. All in favor, say aye or raise your hand. Aye. Rule that motion carries. We are adjourned. Thanks again, everybody, for your time and participation. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. There's another shot at Northern Lights tonight, maybe. So get out there.